Hello and welcome to Darkest Sleep. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Before we start, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now in the comments. It's always cool to see our little community from all over the world. For now, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let your mind relax, because tonight's stories are waiting for you. My name is Marcus, and I've been driving delivery trucks for about 8 years now. Started right out of high school when I couldn't afford college, and honestly, it's been good to me. The pay is decent, I get to see different parts of the state, and most days I'm done by 4 in the afternoon with time to myself. The company I work for delivers medical supplies to hospitals and clinics all over the region. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady, and medical facilities always need their supplies on time, so there's job security in it. Most of my routes are pretty standard: drive to the facility, back up to their loading dock, get the paperwork signed, and move on to the next stop. About 2 years ago, I got assigned a new route that included this small clinic way out in the countryside, about 90 miles north of where I'm based. The place was called Pine Valley Medical Center, though there wasn't much of a valley and I didn't see many pine trees in the area. It was just a single-story building sitting by itself on a country road with maybe 6 or 7 other buildings scattered around what I guess you could call a town. The first few times I delivered there, everything seemed normal enough. It was run by this older doctor, probably in his 60s, who was always very polite and professional. Dr. Hoffman, I think his name was. He'd meet me at the back door, check over the delivery, and sign the paperwork without any fuss. The strange thing was that I never saw any patients there, not once in probably 15 or 20 deliveries over the course of 6 months. No cars in the parking lot except for what I assumed was the doctor's old sedan. No people going in or out. For a medical clinic, it was unusually quiet. But the orders they placed were substantial. They were getting more supplies in a month than some of the bigger hospitals on my route ordered in the same time period. Lots of surgical equipment, medications, and what the invoice called specialized diagnostic tools. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they served a larger area than it appeared, or maybe they did a lot of their work through house calls. It was probably my 8th or 9th delivery there when I first noticed something that didn't sit right with me. I was backing up to their loading dock like always, and Dr. Hoffman came out to meet me. But this time, as he was signing the paperwork, I heard what sounded like someone screaming from inside the building. It only lasted a few seconds, and Dr. Hoffman didn't seem to react to it at all. When I asked him if everything was okay, he looked confused and said he hadn't heard anything. He suggested that maybe I'd heard a siren from the highway, even though we were a good mile from the main road and I hadn't seen any emergency vehicles. I finished the delivery and left, but that scream stuck with me. It didn't sound like someone who was hurt in an accident or having a medical emergency. It sounded like someone who was terrified. The next month, when I made my regular delivery to Pine Valley, I decided to pay a little more attention to what was going on. I arrived at my usual time, around 2 in the afternoon, and everything looked the same as always. Dr. Hoffman's car in the parking lot, no other vehicles, building looking quiet and empty. But as I was unloading the supplies, I noticed something I'd never seen before. There was another door on the side of the building, and it had a heavy padlock on it. Not the kind of lock you'd put on a supply closet or maintenance room. This was serious security hardware, the kind you'd use to make sure nobody could get out. Get in. Nobody could get in. Dr. Hoffman came out right on schedule, and we went through the usual routine. But this time, while he was checking the inventory list, I asked him about the locked door. I said I'd noticed it and wondered if there was a reason he didn't want deliveries made through that entrance instead. The change in his demeanor was immediate. He stopped looking at the paperwork and stared at me for a long moment before saying that was a storage area for hazardous materials and that it was locked for safety reasons. Then he finished signing the papers quickly and went back inside without the usual small talk. That delivery bothered me for days afterward, something about the way Dr. Hoffman had reacted to my question about the door felt wrong, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that a small rural clinic probably shouldn't need the kind of security I'd seen on that side door. I started doing some research when I got home. I looked up Pine Valley Medical Center online, but I couldn't find much information about them. No website, no reviews, not even a listing in the state medical directory that I could find. For a legitimate medical facility, they had practically no online presence at all. Then I tried looking up Dr. Hoffman. That search was even more troubling. I found a doctor. Alan Hoffman, who had been a surgeon at a hospital about 2 hours south of Pine Valley, but according to the articles I found, his medical license had been revoked 5 years earlier following an investigation into unnecessary surgeries and patient endangerment. I wasn't sure it was the same person. Hoffman isn't exactly an uncommon name. But the age seemed about right, and the timing would match up with when the Pine Valley Clinic would have opened. My next delivery there was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the whole weekend trying to decide what to do with the information I'd found. Part of me thought I should call the police, but what would I tell them? That a doctor's license might have been revoked and that I'd heard someone scream once, that didn't seem like enough to justify getting anyone in trouble. But another part of me knew that something wasn't right about that place, and that if I didn't do something, I might regret it for the rest of my life. I decided to arrive early for my Tuesday delivery. Instead of showing up at 2 like usual, I got there around noon and parked my truck down the road where I could see the clinic but hopefully wouldn't be noticed. I wanted to see if there was any activity during times when I normally wasn't there. For the first hour, nothing happened. The parking lot stayed empty except for the doctor's sedan, and I didn't see any movement around the building. But around 1:15, a white van pulled into the parking lot and backed up to that locked side door I'd noticed. 2 men got out of the van. They weren't wearing any kind of medical uniforms or identification, just regular clothes. One of them unlocked the side door while the other opened the back of the van. Then Dr. Hoffman came out of the building and the 3 of them started unloading something from the van. From where I was parked, I couldn't see exactly what they were moving, but whatever it was required all 3 of them to carry it, and they were being very careful with it. They made 3 trips between the van and the building, moving slowly each time like they were carrying something fragile or heavy. After they finished unloading, the 2 men from the van talked with Dr. Hoffman for a few minutes, then got back in their van and left. Dr. Hoffman went back inside and locked the side door behind him. I waited another 30 minutes, then drove over to make my delivery as scheduled. Dr. Hoffman seemed normal when he came out to meet me, maybe a little more rushed than usual, but nothing dramatically different. We completed the transaction like always, and I left without mentioning what I'd seen earlier, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What kind of medical supplies required that level of secrecy? And why would they be delivered separately from the regular supplies that came through my company? I made a decision that I'm still not sure was the right one, but I felt like I had to do something. The following week, instead of just driving away after my delivery, I parked my truck about a quarter mile down the road and walked back to the clinic on foot. The building sat far enough back from the road that I could approach it from behind without being seen from inside. There were a few small windows along the back wall, most of them with blinds closed, but one of them was partially open. I crept up to that window and looked inside. What I saw in there made my stomach turn, and I knew immediately that I'd stumbled onto something terrible. The room looked like an operating theater, but not like any hospital operating room I'd ever seen. It was dirty and improvised, with equipment that looked like it had been cobbled together from different sources. But the worst part was the person on the table. They were unconscious, or at least I hoped they were unconscious, with tubes and wires connected to various machines around the room. And Dr. Hoffman was standing over them with surgical instruments, working on something I couldn't see clearly from my angle. I backed away from the window as quietly as I could and made my way back to my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove straight to the nearest town with a police station and told them everything I'd seen and everything I'd suspected over the past few months. The police took my statement and said they'd look into it, but they also warned me that I could get in serious trouble if my accusations turned out to be unfounded. They said breaking onto private property and looking through windows wasn't something they could officially encourage, even if my intentions were good. 3 days later, I saw on the local news that Pine Valley Medical Center had been raided by state police and federal agents. Dr. Hoffman and 2 other men had been arrested in connection with what the news called an illegal organ harvesting operation. They'd been targeting homeless people and others who wouldn't be missed, performing surgeries to remove organs that were then sold on the black market. The person I'd seen on the table was rescued and was in stable condition at a real hospital. The news report said that without the tip from an anonymous source, the operation might have continued for months or years longer. I never told anyone that I was the anonymous source, not even my family. I just requested a different route from my supervisor and tried to put the whole thing behind me. But sometimes when I'm making deliveries to legitimate hospitals and clinics, I find myself paying attention to things I never noticed before, looking for signs that something might not be what it appears to be. Because if there was one fake clinic operating right under everyone's noses, there might be others. And the next time, there might not be a delivery driver who gets curious enough to ask the right questions. When I was in my early 20s, I worked as a night watchman at an old textile warehouse on the outskirts of Portland. The building had been empty for about 3 years before the new owners hired me to keep an eye on things while they figured out what to do with the place. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent money for what was essentially just walking around an empty building a few times each night. The warehouse was massive, 3 floors of what used to be spinning machines and fabric looms, all cleared out except for the occasional piece of old equipment that was too heavy or worthless to move. Most nights I'd do my rounds, check that all the doors were locked, and spend the rest of my shift reading or watching movies on my phone in the small security office they'd set up for me on the ground floor. Now, I'd been working there for about 4 months when I first noticed the sounds coming from upstairs. It started as just creaking noises, which I figured was normal for an old building. But after a couple weeks, I realized the sounds were too regular to be random settling. They came in patterns, 3 short creaks, followed by a longer one, then silence for exactly 2 minutes before it repeated. I mentioned it to my supervisor during our weekly check-in, but he just laughed it off. Said old buildings make all kinds of noises and that I was probably just getting spooked working alone at night. He told me to focus on making sure nobody was breaking in and not to worry about every little sound the building made. But the thing was, these weren't little sounds anymore. By my 5th month on the job, whatever was making the noise had gotten louder and more frequent. It wasn't just creaking now, it sounded like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor above me. And it always happened at the exact same time each night, 2:47 a.m. I started timing my rounds to avoid being directly under that part of the 2nd floor when the sound started. But one night in early November, curiosity finally got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed up to the 2nd floor at 2:45 a.m., determined to figure out what was making all that racket. The 2nd floor was laid out in a big open space with support beams running across the ceiling. My footsteps echoed as I walked toward the area where I thought the sounds were coming from. I checked my watch, 2:46, 1 minute to go. I positioned myself right under where the dragging sound usually came from and waited. The warehouse was dead silent except for the distant hum of the heating system. Then at exactly 2:47, I heard it directly above me on the 3rd floor. But this time, since I was 1 floor closer, I could hear something else mixed in with the dragging sound. It sounded like whispers. I'll be honest, that scared the hell out of me, but I'd come this far and I wasn't about to back down now. I found the stairway to the 3rd floor and started climbing. Each step felt like it was echoing through the entire building, and I was sure that whoever was up there would hear me coming. The 3rd floor was different from the others. While the first 2 floors had been completely cleared out, the 3rd floor still had some of the old machinery covered in dusty tarps. The ceiling was lower too, with exposed beams and old light fixtures that hadn't been used in years. I made my way toward the area where I thought the sounds were coming from, following the beam of my flashlight across the wooden floor. And that's when I saw them drag marks in the dust. They formed a perfect rectangle about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, like something heavy had been moved back and forth over the same path hundreds of times. I followed the drag marks to where they ended, near one of the covered machines. The tarp over this particular machine was newer than the others, and it was tied down with rope that looked fresh. My hands were shaking as I untied one corner and lifted it up to peek underneath. What I found under that tarp wasn't machinery at all. It was furniture, a bed, a small table, and a chair. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that everything looked like it was still being used. The bed had sheets on it that, while dirty, weren't covered in years of dust like everything else in the warehouse. There was a plate on the table with what looked like recent food scraps and a glass that still had water in it. I dropped the tarp and stepped back, my mind racing. Someone was living up here. Someone had been living directly above me for months while I worked my shifts, and I'd never had a clue. I should have left right then. Should have gone downstairs, called my supervisor, and let someone else deal with it. But something made me lift that tarp again and look more carefully at the setup underneath. That's when I noticed the photographs. They were tacked to the wall behind the bed, dozens of them. And as I shined my flashlight on them to get a better look, my blood ran cold. They were pictures of me arriving at work, me doing my rounds, me sitting in the security office. Some of them were taken from inside the building, which meant whoever was living up here had been watching me for months. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around, but there was nobody there. Then I heard that whispered voice, clearer now that I was on the same floor. "You weren't supposed to find this." I ran, dropped my flashlight, and ran for the stairs as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear someone following, but I didn't look back. I made it to the ground floor and burst through the front door into the parking lot, then kept running until I reached my car. I sat in my car for about 10 minutes trying to decide what to do. Part of me thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was living in the building I was supposed to be guarding. That would probably get me fired for not doing my job properly. Instead, I decided to call my supervisor. I told him everything about the sounds, about what I'd found upstairs, about the photographs. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You did the right thing calling me," he finally said. "I'll handle this, but I need you to do something for me. I need you to go back inside and act like nothing happened." Can you do that? I told him I didn't think I could go back in there, knowing someone was watching me. But he explained that if I didn't return to my post, whoever was upstairs might realize their cover was blown and disappear before the authorities could deal with it. Give me 2 hours, he said. I'll have people there by 5 a.m. to handle the situation. Just 2 more hours and then you never have to go back there again. So I went back inside. I retrieved my flashlight from the 3rd floor. It was lying right where I'd dropped it, and the tarp was back in place like I'd never disturbed it. I spent the next 2 hours in the security office, jumping at every little sound and checking the time every few minutes. At exactly 5 a.m., 3 police cars pulled into the parking lot. My supervisor arrived right behind them, and together they went upstairs while I waited outside. They were up there for about an hour, and when they came back down, they had someone with them in handcuffs. It was a man, probably in his 50s, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. He didn't struggle or say anything as they put him in one of the police cars, but as they drove past me, he turned and looked right at me through the window. The expression on his face wasn't angry or threatening, it was almost sad, like I'd ruined something important to him. My supervisor told me that the man had been living up there for over a year, well before I'd started working there. He'd been surviving on food he stole from nearby restaurants and had been watching every security guard who'd worked in the building. The police found boxes full of photographs going back months before my employment started. They offered to let me finish out my shift, but I told them I was done. I never went back to that warehouse, and I moved to a different part of the city a few weeks later. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself checking over my shoulder when I'm walking alone at night, wondering if someone might be watching me from the shadows. And sometimes, right around 2:47 a.m., I wake up thinking I can hear the sound of something being dragged across the floor above me, even though I live in a single-story house now. I'm David, and I work maintenance for a property management company that handles about 40 apartment buildings around the greater Tampa area. It's not the most exciting job in the world, but I'm good with my hands and I like helping people solve their problems. Most days, I'm fixing leaky faucets, unclogging drains, or replacing burnt-out light fixtures in hallways. The company I work for manages everything from luxury high-rises to older budget complexes, so I see all kinds of living situations. Some places are immaculate, others are pretty rough, but after 12 years doing this work, I thought I'd seen everything there was to see. That changed last spring when I got assigned to a property I'd never worked at before. Sunset Gardens was one of the older complexes we managed, built probably in the 70s, with about 60 units spread across 6 buildings. It wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't the worst either. Just a basic apartment complex where working people could afford to live. My first few calls, there were routine stuff. A broken garbage disposal in 2B, a bathroom door that wouldn't close properly in 4A, typical maintenance requests. The tenants seemed normal enough, though I noticed that a lot of them were pretty quiet and kept to themselves. Not unfriendly, just not particularly chatty when I was working in their units. But there was one apartment that I kept getting called to that started bothering me after a while. Unit 3C was occupied by this elderly woman named Mrs. Chen. She had to be in her 80s, very small and frail, and she spoke English with a heavy accent that made her hard to understand sometimes. The strange thing was that Mrs. Chen called in maintenance requests almost every week. Her toilet would get clogged, or her kitchen sink would stop draining, or she'd say there was a funny smell coming from her bathroom. But every time I went over there to fix whatever she'd reported, I couldn't find anything wrong. The toilet would flush fine, the sink would drain normally, and I never smelled anything unusual. It got to the point where I started wondering if maybe she was getting confused because of her age, or if she was just lonely and wanted someone to talk to. But Mrs. Chen never seemed confused when I talked to her. She was always very specific about what the problem was and where I should look for it, and she never tried to keep me there longer than necessary to do the work. As soon as I told her everything looked fine, she'd thank me politely and I'd leave. After about 2 months of these weekly calls, I mentioned the situation to my supervisor. I told him that Mrs. Chen was a sweet old lady, but that I was spending a lot of time responding to problems that didn't seem to exist. He said that sometimes elderly tenants do get confused or anxious about things, and that as long as she wasn't being abusive or unreasonable, I should just keep responding to her calls and do my best to make her feel secure in her home. So that's what I did. Every week, like clockwork, Mrs. Chen would call in some minor plumbing issue, and I'd show up to find nothing wrong. We developed a routine where I'd check whatever she'd reported, test it to make sure it was working properly, and then give her a little explanation of what I'd found. But then one Thursday morning, I got a call from Mrs. Chen that was different from all the others. Instead of reporting a clogged drain or a running toilet, she said there was something wrong with her bedroom closet door. She said it kept opening by itself during the night and she was worried that the latch mechanism might be broken. When I arrived at her apartment that afternoon, Mrs. Chen looked more upset than I'd ever seen her. She was wringing her hands and seemed genuinely distressed about the closet door. She led me back to her bedroom and showed me the closet in question. It was just a standard bedroom closet with bifold doors, the kind you see in apartments everywhere. I opened and closed it a few times, checked the tracks and the latch, and everything seemed to be working perfectly. The doors stayed closed when I shut them, and there was no obvious reason why they would open on their own. But while I was examining the door mechanism, I noticed something odd about the closet itself. It seemed deeper than it should have been, given the layout of the apartment. I'd worked in dozens of units with the same floor plan, and their bedroom closets were typically about 2 feet deep. Mrs. Chen's closet looked like it went back at least 4 feet. I mentioned this to Mrs. Chen, asking if her unit had been modified or if the closet had been extended somehow. She looked confused by the question and said that the closet had always been that way as far as she knew. She'd been living in the apartment for over 15 years and nothing had ever been changed. I was curious enough to take a closer look. I moved some of Mrs. Chen's clothes aside and used my flashlight to examine the back wall of the closet. That's when I realized that what I was looking at wasn't the back wall of the closet at all. It was a piece of plywood that had been fitted into the closet to make it look like a back wall. I asked Mrs. Chen if she knew why there was a piece of wood blocking off the back of her closet, but she seemed genuinely surprised. She said she'd never noticed it before and had always assumed that was just how the closet was built. With her permission, I removed the plywood panel to see what was behind it. What I found was a space that extended back another 3 feet with rough wooden walls and a concrete floor. It was like a hidden room that had been sealed off from the rest of the apartment. But the strangest thing was that the hidden space wasn't empty. There were blankets on the floor, some empty food containers, and a few personal items like a toothbrush and some old magazines. It looked like someone had been living back there. Mrs. Chen was as shocked as I was. She kept saying that she'd never known there was anything behind that wall, and that she certainly had never given anyone permission to use her closet as some kind of hiding place. I told her we needed to call the police and also contact the property management office to report what we'd found. But before I could make those calls, Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm and asked me to wait. She said that over the past few months she'd been hearing noises at night that she couldn't explain. Soft sounds like someone moving around or what sounded like whispering. She thought she was imagining things because of her age and she'd been embarrassed to mention it to anyone. She also said that she'd been finding small things moved around in her apartment. A cup in a different cabinet than where she'd left it, or a book moved from one table to another. Again, she'd assumed she was just forgetting where she'd put things. But now, looking at this hidden space in her closet, she realized that someone might have been coming into her apartment regularly without her knowledge. Someone who knew about the false wall and had been using the hidden room as a place to stay. I asked her if she'd noticed anything missing from her apartment, like food or money, but she said she hadn't. Whoever had been using the space seemed to have been careful not to take anything obvious or do any damage that would attract attention. We called the police together and they sent over 2 officers to investigate. They took pictures of the hidden room and collected some of the items they found there as evidence. They also dusted for fingerprints and asked Mrs. Chen and me a lot of questions about when we discovered the space and whether we disturbed anything. The officers told us that they'd seen similar situations before, where people gained access to apartments through utility areas or maintenance spaces and created hidden living areas without the knowledge of the tenants or property owners. They said it was more common than most people realized, especially in older buildings where the construction might have created unused spaces. They also said that in most cases, the people doing this weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were usually homeless individuals looking for a warm, dry place to stay, and they typically went to great lengths to avoid detection by the legitimate occupants of the building. But they warned Mrs. Chen that even if the person's intentions weren't harmful, having an unauthorized person with access to her apartment was a serious safety concern. They arranged for a locksmith to come out that same day to change all her locks, and they increased patrols in the area for the next few weeks. I reported everything to my supervisor, and the property management company had the entire building inspected to make sure there weren't any other hidden spaces or security vulnerabilities. They found 2 more false walls in other units, both in apartments that were currently vacant, but neither showed signs of recent use. Mrs. Chen thanked me repeatedly for taking her closet door complaint seriously, and for investigating thoroughly instead of just assuming she was confused. She said that if I hadn't noticed the closet was deeper than it should have been, she might have continued living with someone secretly sharing her apartment indefinitely. I still do maintenance work at Sunset Gardens, and I still respond to Mrs. Chen's weekly service calls. But now when she reports a problem, I take extra time to really examine whatever she's concerned about. Because sometimes what looks like a confused elderly person complaining about imaginary problems is actually someone who's noticed that something isn't quite right, even if they can't put their finger on what it is. And every time I work in an apartment now, I pay attention to things like closet depths and room dimensions, just to make sure everything matches up the way it should. Because you never know what people might be hiding behind a piece of plywood. My name is Tony, and for about 3 years I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station just outside Bakersfield. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills while I was taking classes during the day to get my certification as an HVAC technician. The station I worked at was one of those places that gets most of its business from truckers and people traveling long distances on the interstate. During my shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., I'd maybe see 20 customers on a busy night. Most of the time it was just me, a pot of coffee, and whatever book I was reading for school. The job was pretty straightforward. Keep the coffee fresh, restock the coolers, mop the floors, and help customers who came in to pay for gas or buy snacks. The only real requirement was that I had to do a security walk around the outside of the building every 2 hours to make sure everything looked normal. About 6 months into the job, I started noticing this one customer who came in regularly around 3:30 in the morning. He was probably in his 40s, average height, always wore the same dark jacket and baseball cap. He'd buy a large coffee and a pack of cigarettes, pay in cash, and leave without much conversation. What struck me as odd was that he never drove up to the gas pumps. He'd just appear at the front door, make his purchase, and walk back out into the parking lot. I never saw what kind of car he drove or which direction he went when he left. He'd just disappear into the darkness outside the range of our parking lot lights. At first, I figured maybe he parked his car somewhere I couldn't see it from inside the store. Maybe he worked nearby and was walking over on his break. But after a few weeks of seeing him, I started paying more attention during my security walks. The thing was, there wasn't anywhere nearby for him to be walking from. The gas station sat by itself next to the highway, with empty fields on 3 sides and just a closed-down restaurant about half a mile down the road. During my outside security checks, I never saw any cars parked where they shouldn't be, and I never saw anyone walking around the property. But every few nights, this guy would show up right around 3:30, buy his coffee and cigarettes, and vanish back into the night. I mentioned it to Jerry, the guy who worked the evening shift before me, and he said he'd never seen anyone matching that description. I also asked Linda, who worked the morning shift after me, and she said the same thing. As far as they knew, there wasn't any regular customer who came in at that time of night. After about 2 months of seeing this guy regularly, I decided to try starting a conversation with him. Nothing pushy, just the kind of small talk you make with regular customers. But every time I tried to engage him beyond the basic transaction, he'd just nod politely and head for the door. He never seemed unfriendly or suspicious, just very focused on getting his coffee and cigarettes and leaving as quickly as possible. And he always had exact change, like he'd counted it out before coming in. Then one night in November, he didn't show up at his usual time. 3:30 came and went, then 4 o'clock, then 4:30. I kept expecting to see him walk through the door, but my shift ended and he never appeared. The next night, same thing, no sign of him at 3:30 or any other time during my shift. I started wondering if maybe he'd moved away or changed jobs or just decided to buy his coffee somewhere else. But then, about a week later, he was back. Same time, same routine, same coffee and cigarettes. I was actually relieved to see him, which sounds strange, but when you work alone at night, even the weird regular customers become a familiar part of your routine. I decided to ask him where he'd been the past week, just casual conversation, but his reaction was completely different from anything I'd seen before. Instead of his usual polite nod, he stopped and stared at me for a long moment. Then he asked me what day it was. I told him it was Thursday, November 15th. He looked confused and asked me what year it was. When I told him it was 2019, he got this expression on his face like he'd just received terrible news. He left his coffee and cigarettes on the counter, walked out the front door, and I never saw him again. I was puzzled by the whole interaction, but I figured maybe the guy had been having some kind of personal problems or health issues that were affecting his memory. It wasn't really any of my business, and after a few weeks I stopped thinking about it. But then, about 6 months later, I was doing some research for a school paper about local history, and I came across an old newspaper article that made my blood run cold. The article was from November 2003, and it described a fatal car accident that had happened right in front of the gas station where I worked. A man in his 40s had been driving alone when his car went off the road and crashed into the field beside the station. The accident happened at approximately 3:30 in the morning, and the driver was pronounced dead at the scene. The article included a photo of the accident victim. It was the same man who'd been coming into the store to buy coffee and cigarettes. The same dark jacket, the same baseball cap, even the same face, though 16 years younger in the newspaper photo. According to the article, the man had been driving home from his job at a factory about 20 miles away. He worked the night shift and always stopped at our gas station to buy coffee and cigarettes before making the drive home. The night he died, he'd made his usual purchase and was walking back to his car when he apparently suffered some kind of medical episode that caused him to lose control of his vehicle. I read that article 3 times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The dates didn't add up. The man in the article had died in 2003, but I'd been talking to him regularly in 2019. I looked up more information about the accident and found the man's obituary. His name was Robert Chen, and he'd left behind a wife and 2 young children. The obituary mentioned that he was a regular customer at the Shell station where he always bought coffee before driving home from work. I never told anyone at work about what I'd discovered. How do you explain that you've been serving coffee to a dead man for 6 months? But I did start paying more attention to the other regular customers who came in during the late night hours. Most of them were truckers or travelers, people I could easily verify were alive and normal. But there was one woman who came in every Sunday around 2 a.m. to buy energy drinks, and she always paid with cash that looked older than it should have been. And there was an elderly man who bought lottery tickets every Friday night, except that the numbers he asked for were always from drawings that had happened years earlier. I finished my HVAC certification and quit the gas station job about a year after finding that newspaper article. I work normal daytime hours now, installing and repairing air conditioning systems for a company in town. But sometimes when I'm driving past that gas station late at night, I wonder if Robert Chen is still showing up at 3:30 in the morning, looking for his coffee and cigarettes, unaware that he's been dead for 20 years. And I wonder how many other people are out there, going through the motions of routines they followed in life, not realizing that their time has already come to an end. I'm Rebecca, and I work as a home health aide for elderly clients who need assistance with daily activities but want to stay in their own homes instead of moving to assisted living facilities. It's rewarding work, helping people maintain their independence and dignity, though it can be emotionally challenging when clients are dealing with serious health issues. Most of my clients are assigned to me through the agency I work for, but occasionally I get referrals from family members or other healthcare providers who know someone in need of services. That's how I ended up working for Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an 87-year-old woman who lived alone in a large Victorian house on the outskirts of Salem. Mrs. Hartwell had been referred to me by her nephew, who lived in another state and was worried about her living alone. He said she was sharp mentally but was having trouble with mobility and needed someone to help with grocery shopping, light housekeeping, and medication management. When I first met Mrs. Hartwell, I was impressed by how articulate and alert she was. She gave me a thorough tour of her house, explaining the history of different rooms and pointing out family photographs and heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. The house itself was beautiful, with high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and period furniture that had been meticulously maintained. We established a routine where I'd visit her 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons. I'd help her with bathing, prepare meals, organize her medications, and do light cleaning around the house. Mrs. Hartwell was always grateful for the help and seemed to enjoy having someone to talk with about her garden, her books, and memories of her late husband. The only thing that struck me as unusual was how many photographs she had displayed throughout the house. Not just family photos, but hundreds of pictures of people I assumed were friends, neighbors, and acquaintances from throughout her life. Every room had multiple photo albums, framed pictures on tables and mantels, and even boxes of loose photographs stacked in corners. Mrs. Hartwell noticed me looking at all the photos during one of my visits and explained that she'd always been passionate about photography. She said she'd documented every important event in her community for decades, and that many families had asked her to photograph their weddings, graduations, and other celebrations. She showed me some of her favorite pictures, including several that had been published in the local newspaper over the years. She had a good eye for capturing candid moments and natural expressions, and I could see why people had sought out her services as a photographer. But after working with Mrs. Hartwell for about 2 months, I started noticing something odd about some of the photographs. Many of the people in the pictures looked like they were sleeping or possibly unconscious. Their eyes were closed and their faces had a peaceful, relaxed expression, but something about their posture and coloring didn't look quite natural. When I asked Mrs. Hartwell about these particular photos, she said they were part of a series she'd done on meditation and relaxation techniques. She said she'd been interested in capturing people in states of deep rest and inner peace. The explanation made sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about those pictures. The people in them were too still, too pale, and their positioning looked too carefully arranged to be natural sleep or meditation poses. I started paying closer attention to the photographs during my visits, and I realized that many of the people Mrs. Hartwell had photographed in these peaceful poses were people I recognized from obituaries in the local newspaper. Not recent obituaries, but deaths that had occurred over the past several decades. I did some research at the public library and confirmed that at least a dozen of the people in Mrs. Hartwell's meditation photographs had died within a few days of when the pictures appeared to have been taken, based on the clothing and settings visible in the images. At first, I wondered if Mrs. Hartwell had been hired to take memorial photographs of people who were very ill, and if they died shortly after the photo sessions. That would explain the timing and the peaceful expressions on their faces, but then I found something that changed my perspective entirely. While helping Mrs. Hartwell organize some boxes in her basement, I discovered a collection of newspaper clippings dating back to the 1960s. They were all obituaries of people from the local area, and each obituary had been carefully cut out and pasted into a scrapbook. What made this discovery disturbing was that every single obituary corresponded to one of the people in Mrs. Hartwell's photography collection. She had documented the deaths of hundreds of community members over the decades, and she'd apparently photographed many of them shortly before they died. I also found business cards and old advertisements that indicated Mrs. Hartwell had operated a photography service that specialized in memorial portraits and final remembrance photographs. The advertising language was carefully worded, but it became clear that she'd built a business around photographing people who were near death. When I confronted Mrs. Hartwell about what I'd found, she didn't seem surprised or upset. She explained that she'd provided a valuable service to families who wanted a final, peaceful image of their loved ones to remember them by. She said that many cultures had traditions of post-mortem photography, and that she'd simply been continuing that practice in a modern context. She showed me contracts and payment records that proved families had hired her for these services, and testimonial letters from grateful relatives who said her photographs had brought them comfort during their grief. But as I looked through more of her records, I discovered that not all of her subjects had been photographed at the request of family members. Some of the contracts were signed by Mrs. Hartwell herself, and the payment came from her own accounts. When I asked her about these self-commissioned photographs, Mrs. Hartwell became evasive. She said that sometimes she'd felt called to document someone's passing even when the family hadn't thought to hire a photographer, and that she'd considered it a form of community service. But the timing of some of these photographs troubled me. According to the dates on the pictures and the death certificates I'd found, Mrs. Hartwell had sometimes photographed people days or even weeks before they actually died. In some cases, the photographs appeared to have been taken while the subjects were still relatively healthy. I realized that Mrs. Hartwell might have been doing more than just documenting deaths. She might have been predicting them, or possibly even causing them. I reported my concerns to the police, providing copies of the photographs, obituary clippings, and business records I'd found. They opened an investigation and discovered that Mrs. Hartwell had been present in the homes or hospital rooms of an unusually large number of people who died over the past several decades. Further investigation revealed that she'd often volunteered to sit with dying patients or help elderly neighbors with daily tasks, always offering to document their final days through photography. In many cases, people who'd been expected to live for months or years had died within days of Mrs. Hartwell's involvement in their care. The police were never able to prove that Mrs. Hartwell had directly caused any deaths, but the statistical correlation was too strong to ignore. She'd been present for over 300 deaths in a community where the average person might witness a handful of deaths over their entire lifetime. Mrs. Hartwell was eventually charged with elder abuse and fraud related to her unauthorized photography business, but she died of natural causes before the case went to trial. She was 88 years old. After her death, I learned that her nephew had never actually referred her to my agency. The initial contact had come from someone claiming to be a relative, but no such person existed. Mrs. Hartwell had apparently arranged for her own home health care, possibly because she'd realized that her activities were being scrutinized and she wanted to appear to be receiving legitimate medical attention. I still work as a home health aide, but I'm much more careful now about verifying client referrals and checking the backgrounds of new clients. And I pay attention when clients have unusual hobbies or interests that involve documenting other people's personal moments. Because sometimes the people who seem most concerned about preserving memories are actually the ones creating the tragedies they're so eager to document. My name is Carlos, and I drove city buses for the Metro Transit Authority for 15 years before I retired last year. Mostly I worked day shifts, but for about 3 years I was assigned to Route 47, which was a late-night line that ran from downtown out to the airport and back. Route 47 wasn't the most popular run among drivers. It operated from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., carrying mostly airport workers, late shift employees, and the occasional traveler who missed their connection. The route took about 90 minutes round trip, so you'd make maybe 4 complete cycles during a shift. The pay was decent because of the overnight differential, and I actually enjoyed the quiet pace compared to the crowded daytime routes. Most nights I'd have maybe 20 passengers total, and many of them were regulars who I got to know over time. There was one passenger, though, who stood out from all the others. An older woman, probably in her 70s, who got on at the downtown terminal every night at exactly 11:15 p.m. She always sat in the same seat, third row from the front, on the right side, and she always got off at Maple Street, which was about halfway to the airport. What made her memorable wasn't just her punctuality, but the fact that she always carried a large canvas bag with her, and she'd spend the entire ride knitting something. I could see her in my rearview mirror, her hands moving steadily with the knitting needles, never looking up from her work. She was polite when she boarded, always said good evening and thanked me when she got off, but she never engaged in conversation beyond basic courtesy. Just a quiet, elderly woman who apparently had somewhere important to be every night at the same time. After about 6 months of seeing her regularly, I started wondering where she was going. The Maple Street stop was in a residential neighborhood, but it wasn't near any major businesses or facilities that would require someone to arrive there at midnight every night. One slow Tuesday, when she was the only passenger on the bus, I asked her if she lived in the Maple Street area. She looked up from her knitting and said she was visiting someone who needed her help. When I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said that some people needed assistance during the difficult hours and that she tried to be there for them when she could. I figured she was probably a home health aide or volunteer caregiver who worked nights, which would explain the regular schedule and the need to arrive at the same time every evening. But then I started noticing something odd about her knitting projects. Every few weeks she'd finish whatever she was working on and start something new. But the finished items all looked like the same thing, small blankets or shawls, always in soft colors like cream or pale blue. Over the course of several months, I watched her complete probably 15 or 20 of these identical projects. She worked quickly and skillfully, and each finished piece looked carefully made and beautifully crafted. I mentioned to her one evening that she must be knitting for a large family or maybe for a charitable organization. She looked up from her needles and said that she made them for people who were going on long journeys and needed something to keep them comfortable. The way she said it struck me as unusual. She didn't say long trips or traveling, she specifically said long journeys, and her tone was almost reverent when she said it. After about a year of seeing this woman regularly, I started paying attention to where exactly she went after getting off at the Maple Street stop. The bus stop was right at the corner of Maple and 5th Street, and from my driver's seat I could see about 2 blocks in each direction. Every night she'd get off the bus, cross the street, and walk toward a large brick building that took up most of the block. I'd assumed it was an apartment building or maybe an office complex, but one night when I had some time between runs, I drove past the building to get a better look at it. It wasn't residential or commercial. It was Riverside Memorial Hospital, a facility that specialized in long-term care for terminally ill patients. The kind of place where people went when curative treatment was no longer possible, and the focus was on comfort and pain management. That explained why the woman's schedule was so regular and why she talked about helping people during difficult hours. She was probably a volunteer who spent time with patients who might not have family members able to visit during the night shift. But I couldn't stop thinking about those small blankets she knitted. 15 or 20 identical projects over the course of a year seemed like a lot, even for someone who was volunteering regularly at a hospital. A few weeks later, I mentioned the woman to my cousin Maria, who worked as a nurse at Riverside Memorial. I described her appearance and her regular schedule, and asked if she knew about volunteers who came in late at night to help with patients. Maria looked confused and said that the hospital didn't allow volunteer visitors after 8 p.m., and that they certainly didn't have any volunteers who came in at midnight every night. She said that would violate multiple policies about patient safety and security. When I described the woman in more detail, including her knitting and the small blankets she made, Maria's expression changed completely. She asked me to describe the blankets again, and when I told her about the soft colors and careful craftsmanship, she got very quiet. Maria told me that hospitals sometimes use special blankets or shrouds for patients who had died, and that some facilities had volunteers who made these items as a way of providing dignity and comfort for the deceased and their families. But she also said that Riverside Memorial purchased all of their mortuary supplies from professional vendors, and that they didn't rely on volunteer-made items for post-mortem care. She suggested that I might want to report what I'd observed to the hospital's security office, just to make sure that someone wasn't gaining unauthorized access to patient care areas. I wrestled with that suggestion for several days. The woman seemed harmless, and if she was providing some kind of comfort to patients or families, I didn't want to get her in trouble. But Maria's concerns about hospital security made sense, and I realized that I might be enabling something inappropriate by not reporting it. I finally decided to call the hospital's security office and describe what I'd observed. I explained that I was a bus driver who noticed someone walking toward their building every night at the same time, and that I wanted to make sure it wasn't a security concern. The security supervisor thanked me for calling and said they'd look into it. He asked for a detailed description of the woman and information about her schedule, which I provided. 3 days later, the woman didn't show up for her usual 11:15 bus. That was the first time in over a year that she'd missed her regular ride. The next night, same thing, no sign of her at the downtown terminal. About a week later, I got a call from the hospital security supervisor. He said they'd investigated my report and discovered that someone had been gaining unauthorized access to their facility through a service entrance that wasn't properly secured. They'd found evidence that this person had been entering patient rooms where people had recently died, and that small handmade blankets had been placed on several deceased patients without authorization from medical staff or family members. The security supervisor said that the person had been trespassed from the property and would be arrested if they returned, but that they hadn't been able to identify who it was or how long the unauthorized visits had been going on. He also mentioned that they'd consulted with the medical examiner's office and that placing unauthorized items on deceased patients could potentially interfere with post-mortem procedures or contaminate evidence in cases where the cause of death needed to be investigated. I never saw the knitting woman again after that week she stopped showing up for the bus. Her regular seat stayed empty at 11:15 every night, and I found myself checking my rearview mirror out of habit, expecting to see her hands moving with the knitting needles. I retired from Metro Transit about 2 years later, but I still drive past that bus stop sometimes when I'm in the neighborhood. And whenever I see Riverside Memorial Hospital, I wonder if that woman found another way to continue her unauthorized mission of providing comfort blankets for people who were no longer able to appreciate the gesture. Sometimes the people who seem most devoted to helping others are actually serving their own needs in ways that cross boundaries no one should cross. I'm Jennifer, and I work as a property manager for a company that owns several small apartment buildings in college towns across the Midwest. My job involves everything from showing units to prospective tenants to coordinating maintenance and handling lease agreements. One of the properties I manage is a converted house near the University of Iowa campus. It was originally built as a single-family home in the 1920s, but it had been divided into 4 apartment units sometime in the 60s. The layout was a bit awkward because of the conversion, but the location was great for students and the rent was reasonable. The building had been part of our portfolio for about 3 years when I took over managing it, and according to the previous manager, it had always been a solid rental property with minimal problems and reliable tenants. But about 6 months after I started managing the building, I began getting complaints from tenants about strange noises coming from the walls. Not plumbing or electrical sounds, but what they described as scratching or tapping noises that seemed to move around inside the walls throughout the day and night. The first complaint came from Amy, a graduate student who lived in Unit 2A. She said the scratching sounds were keeping her awake at night and seemed to be coming from the wall between her bedroom and the hallway. She was worried that mice or rats had gotten into the wall space and were building nests there. I arranged for our pest control contractor to inspect the building, but he didn't find any evidence of rodent activity. No droppings, no gnaw marks, no entry points that would allow animals to access the interior walls, but the complaints continued. Within a few weeks, tenants from all 4 units were reporting similar scratching and tapping sounds. They said the noises seemed to follow patterns, like someone was deliberately making them rather than animals randomly moving around. I had our maintenance contractor examine the walls more thoroughly, thinking maybe there was an issue with settling or expansion that was causing the building materials to make noise. But his inspection didn't reveal any structural problems that would explain the sounds the tenants were describing. The noises were becoming a real problem for tenant retention. 2 students moved out at the end of their leases specifically because of the wall sounds, and prospective tenants who came for showings sometimes commented that they could hear strange noises during their visits. I decided to spend a full day at the building myself, listening for the sounds and trying to determine what might be causing them. I arrived early in the morning and positioned myself in different units throughout the day, hoping to hear whatever the tenants were experiencing. Around midday, while I was sitting in the common hallway between units, I finally heard what they'd been complaining about. It was definitely scratching sounds, and they seemed to be coming from inside the wall about 4 feet off the ground. But the pattern was too regular and deliberate to be caused by animals. The scratching would happen in groups of 3, followed by a pause, then 3 more scratches. It would continue for several minutes, stop for maybe 10 minutes, then start again in a slightly different location along the wall. I called our maintenance contractor and asked him to come out immediately to investigate the wall where I was hearing the sounds. When he arrived, he used a stud finder and other tools to examine the wall construction, but he couldn't determine what might be causing the noises. Finally, he suggested that we cut a small inspection hole in the drywall to see what was actually inside the wall space. I authorized the work, figuring that a small repair would be worth it if we could solve the mystery and keep our tenants happy. When he cut through the drywall, we discovered that the wall contained not just the usual insulation and framing, but also a narrow space that had apparently been created during the original conversion of the house into apartments. Inside that space, we found something that explained the scratching sounds but raised much more serious questions. There were dozens of small marks scratched into the wooden framing members, along with what appeared to be messages or symbols carved into the wood with some kind of sharp tool. Most of the scratch messages were illegible or incoherent, but some of them were clearly pleas for help. Things like "let me out" and "someone please help me," and dates going back several years. We also found personal items that had apparently been dropped or hidden in the wall space. A driver's license, some jewelry, and a cell phone that looked like it had been there for a long time. I immediately called the police to report what we'd found. When the officers arrived and examined the wall space, they determined that it was large enough for a person to fit inside, and that someone could potentially access it through a panel in the basement that we hadn't known existed. The investigation revealed that the previous property manager had been using the hidden wall space to imprison tenants who had complained about problems or fallen behind on rent. He would drug their food or drinks, then move them into the wall space while they were unconscious. The victims would wake up trapped in the narrow space between walls, able to hear normal life going on around them but unable to escape or attract attention. The scratching sounds the current tenants had been hearing were the attempts of previous victims to signal for help. Police found evidence that at least 6 tenants had been imprisoned in the wall space over a period of 3 years. Some had eventually been released when they agreed to stop complaining and pay additional fees, but others had died from dehydration or medical conditions while trapped inside the walls. The previous property manager was arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and murder. During his confession, he said he'd created the hidden space as a way to teach problem tenants a lesson, and that he'd never intended for anyone to die. The building was closed pending a complete investigation and renovation. The company I work for cooperated fully with law enforcement and provided victim assistance to the families of people who had been harmed. I no longer manage that particular property, but the experience changed how I approach tenant complaints and property maintenance issues. I take every concern seriously now, no matter how strange or minor it might seem, because sometimes what sounds like a simple maintenance problem is actually someone trying to ask for help in the only way they can. And whenever I'm showing apartments to prospective tenants, I pay close attention to unusual architectural features or spaces that don't quite match the building's original layout. Because sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones that are hidden in plain sight, right behind the walls where people assume they're safe. My name is Kevin, and I work as a delivery driver for one of those food delivery apps that became really popular over the past few years. It's not my full-time job. I do it evenings and weekends to supplement my income from my day job at an auto parts store. Most of the deliveries are pretty routine. Pick up food from a restaurant, drive to the customer's address, drop off the order, and move on to the next one. The app handles all the payment processing, so there's usually minimal interaction with customers beyond confirming their name and handing over their food. But there's one delivery I'll never forget, and it's made me much more cautious about the orders I accept, especially late-night deliveries to residential addresses. It was a Saturday night in October around 11:30 p.m. when I got an order for Chinese food from a place called Golden Dragon. The delivery address was in a suburban neighborhood about 15 minutes from the restaurant, and the order was pretty large, probably $60 worth of food for what appeared to be multiple people. The customer's name in the app was listed as Johnson, and there were specific delivery instructions that said to ring the doorbell twice and leave the food on the front porch. The instructions also mentioned that payment had been made through the app, including a generous tip, so I wouldn't need to collect any money. I picked up the order from Golden Dragon and headed to the delivery address. The house was in a quiet residential area with large lots and mature trees. It was a 2-story colonial-style house with a long driveway and no visible lights on in any of the windows. Following the customer's instructions, I rang the doorbell twice and set the bags of food on the front porch. I waited a few seconds to see if anyone would come to the door, but when no one appeared, I took a photo of the delivery as required by the app and headed back to my car. As I was driving away, I noticed in my rearview mirror that someone had come out to collect the food. It was hard to see clearly in the darkness, but it looked like a person wearing dark clothing who quickly grabbed the bags and went back inside. I didn't think much about the delivery until the following Saturday, when I got another order for the same address. Same restaurant, similar amount of food, same delivery instructions, and same customer name. The only difference was that this time the order included a note asking me to be as quiet as possible when making the delivery. Again, I followed the instructions exactly, rang the doorbell twice, left the food on the porch, and drove away. And again, I saw someone come out to collect the food as soon as I left. This pattern continued for several weeks. Every Saturday night around the same time, I'd get an order for Chinese food to be delivered to the Johnson house. The orders were always substantial, always paid for in advance with a good tip, and always came with instructions to leave the food on the porch without waiting for direct contact. After about 6 weeks of these regular deliveries, I started getting curious about why this customer ordered the same thing at the same time every week, and why they were so specific about not wanting direct interaction with the delivery person. One Saturday night, instead of driving away immediately after dropping off the food, I parked my car down the street where I could still see the house. I wanted to get a better look at whoever was coming out to collect the orders. When the person emerged from the house to get the food, I could see them more clearly under the porch light. It was a middle-aged man wearing what looked like medical scrubs or some kind of work uniform. He moved quickly and efficiently, grabbing all the food bags at once and immediately returning to the house. But what struck me as odd was that he looked around nervously before and after collecting the food, like he was worried about being seen or heard. His behavior seemed more consistent with someone who was trying to hide something than with someone who was simply receiving a food delivery. The following week, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of just leaving the food and driving away, I rang the doorbell twice as instructed, but then I stayed on the porch for a few extra seconds to see if anyone would come to the door. After about 30 seconds, the door opened slightly, and the same man I'd seen collecting food peered out. He looked surprised to see me still standing there, and he asked why I hadn't left the food and gone like I was supposed to. I told him I was new and wasn't sure about the procedure, and I asked if he wanted to check the order to make sure everything was correct. He seemed very anxious about me being there and kept looking back into the house like he was worried about something inside. He quickly looked through the food bags, confirmed that everything was there, and asked me to leave immediately. But as he was closing the door, I heard what sounded like someone calling for help from inside the house. It was faint and muffled, like it was coming from another room or possibly another floor, but it was definitely a human voice saying something that sounded like "help me" or "please help." The man at the door heard it too, because his expression changed immediately. He slammed the door shut without saying anything else, and I heard multiple locks being engaged from inside. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. Part of me thought I might have misheard the voice, or that it could have. My name is Kevin, and I work as a delivery driver for one of those food delivery apps that became really popular over the past few years. It's not my full-time job. I do it evenings and weekends to supplement my income from my day job at an auto parts store. Most of the deliveries are pretty routine. Pick up food from a restaurant, drive to the customer's address, drop off the order, and move on to the next one. The app handles all the payment processing, so there's usually minimal interaction with customers beyond confirming their name and handing over their food. But there's one delivery I'll never forget, and it's made me much more cautious about the orders I accept, especially late-night deliveries to residential addresses. It was a Saturday night in October around 11:30 p.m. when I got an order for Chinese food from a place called Golden Dragon. The delivery address was in a suburban neighborhood about 15 minutes from the restaurant, and the order was pretty large, probably $60 worth of food for what appeared to be multiple people. The customer's name in the app was listed as Johnson, and there were specific delivery instructions that said to ring the doorbell twice and leave the food on the front porch. The instructions also mentioned that payment had been made through the app, including a generous tip, so I wouldn't need to collect any money. I picked up the order from Golden Dragon and headed to the delivery address. The house was in a quiet residential area with large lots and mature trees. It was a 2-story colonial-style house with a long driveway and no visible lights on in any of the windows. Following the customer's instructions, I rang the doorbell twice and set the bags of food on the front porch. I waited a few seconds to see if anyone would come to the door, but when no one appeared, I took a photo of the delivery as required by the app and headed back to my car. As I was driving away, I noticed in my rearview mirror that someone had come out to collect the food. It was hard to see clearly in the darkness, but it looked like a person wearing dark clothing who quickly grabbed the bags and went back inside. I didn't think much about the delivery until the following Saturday, when I got another order for the same address. Same restaurant, similar amount of food, same delivery instructions, and same customer name. The only difference was that this time the order included a note asking me to be as quiet as possible when making the delivery. Again, I followed the instructions exactly, rang the doorbell twice, left the food on the porch, and drove away. And again, I saw someone come out to collect the food as soon as I left. This pattern continued for several weeks. Every Saturday night around the same time, I'd get an order for Chinese food to be delivered to the Johnson house. The orders were always substantial, always paid for in advance with a good tip, and always came with instructions to leave the food on the porch without waiting for direct contact. After about 6 weeks of these regular deliveries, I started getting curious about why this customer ordered the same thing at the same time every week, and why they were so specific about not wanting direct interaction with the delivery person. One Saturday night, instead of driving away immediately after dropping off the food, I parked my car down the street where I could still see the house. I wanted to get a better look at whoever was coming out to collect the orders. When the person emerged from the house to get the food, I could see them more clearly under the porch light. It was a middle-aged man wearing what looked like medical scrubs or some kind of work uniform. He moved quickly and efficiently, grabbing all the food bags at once and immediately returning to the house. But what struck me as odd was that he looked around nervously before and after collecting the food, like he was worried about being seen or heard. His behavior seemed more consistent with someone who was trying to hide something than with someone who was simply receiving a food delivery. The following week, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of just leaving the food and driving away, I rang the doorbell twice as instructed, but then I stayed on the porch for a few extra seconds to see if anyone would come to the door. After about 30 seconds, the door opened slightly, and the same man I'd seen collecting food peered out. He looked surprised to see me still standing there, and he asked why I hadn't left the food and gone like I was supposed to. I told him I was new and wasn't sure about the procedure, and I asked if he wanted to check the order to make sure everything was correct. He seemed very anxious about me being there and kept looking back into the house like he was worried about something inside. He quickly looked through the food bags, confirmed that everything was there, and asked me to leave immediately. But as he was closing the door, I heard what sounded like someone calling for help from inside the house. It was faint and muffled, like it was coming from another room or possibly another floor, but it was definitely a human voice saying something that sounded like "help me" or "please help." The man at the door heard it too, because his expression changed immediately. He slammed the door shut without saying anything else, and I heard multiple locks being engaged from inside. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. Part of me thought I might have misheard the voice, or that it could have been a television or radio playing inside the house. But the man's reaction told me that I definitely heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. I decided to call the police non-emergency line to report what I'd observed. I explained that I was a delivery driver and that I'd heard what sounded like someone calling for help from inside a house where I'd been making regular deliveries. The dispatcher took down all the information, the address, the customer's name, and a description of what I'd heard and seen. She said they'd send an officer to do a welfare check at the address and that they might need to contact me later for additional information. About 2 hours later, I got a call from a police detective who said they'd responded to the address I'd provided. When officers knocked on the door, no one answered, but they could hear sounds from inside that suggested people were present in the house. They'd obtained a warrant to enter the property, and what they found inside explained why the customer had been so insistent about contactless food deliveries and why someone had been calling for help. The man who'd been collecting the food orders had been holding 3 people captive in the basement of the house. 2 women and 1 man, all in their 20s, who had been reported missing from various locations over the past several months. The captor had been keeping them chained in the basement and had been ordering large amounts of food every week to feed his prisoners. He'd chosen contactless delivery specifically to avoid having delivery drivers see or interact with anyone who might ask questions or become suspicious. The detective told me that the victims were all alive and had been taken to the hospital for medical treatment. They were malnourished and had been physically abused, but they were expected to recover from their injuries. The man who'd been holding them was arrested and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and multiple other felonies. During his interrogation, he admitted that he'd been planning to eventually move his operation to a different location, and that the food delivery routine had been part of his strategy to keep the victims alive until he was ready to transport them. The detective said that my decision to report what I'd heard had probably saved the lives of all 3 victims, because the captor had been planning to move them within the next few days to a more remote location where they might never have been found. I testified at the trial about my experiences making deliveries to the house and what I'd observed during my regular visits. The defense attorney tried to suggest that I'd misunderstood what I'd heard, but the victim's testimony about calling for help whenever they heard someone at the door supported my account of events. The man was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After that experience, I became much more attentive to unusual customer requests and delivery situations. I pay attention when customers insist on no-contact deliveries to houses that seem too quiet, or when delivery instructions seem designed to prevent any interaction with people who might be inside. I also started reporting my concerns to police more readily when something doesn't feel right about a delivery situation. Most of the time, my suspicions turn out to be nothing, but I'd rather call in a false alarm than ignore something that could be a sign that someone needs help. The food delivery apps have since implemented better safety protocols for drivers, including better lighting requirements for delivery addresses and clearer procedures for reporting suspicious situations. But I still think the most important safety tool is trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who try to blend in with normal, everyday activities like ordering food for dinner. And sometimes a routine delivery is the only opportunity a victim has to signal for help from the outside world.